She stood at the altar, the weight of her wedding dress pressing down on her shoulders like a burden too heavy to bear. Tears welled in her eyes, not of joy, but of something deeper, something darker. The man before her, the one she had promised to love and cherish, was hiding something. A secret so shocking that when she finally uncovered it, her entire world shattered. What could make a bride weep on the happiest day of her life? And why did her husband's truth leave her breathless with disbelief? The morning sun cast a golden glow over the city, painting everything in soft, warm hues. She stood by the window of her childhood bedroom, gazing at the skyline with a heart full of dreams. Today was the day she had waited for all her life, her wedding day. A day that was supposed to be perfect, filled with love, laughter, and the promise of forever. As she turned to look at the white dress hanging neatly on the door, a smile tugged at her lips. It was everything she had imagined, elegant, timeless, and made just for her. Her mother and bridesmaids bustled around the room, fussing over last-minute details, their excitement filling the air like a sweet melody. She should have felt the same rush of joy, the same flutter of anticipation, but somewhere deep inside her, a shadow lingered. She shook off the feeling, telling herself it was just nerves. Every bride felt this way, right? It was normal to be overwhelmed. After all, she was marrying the love of her life, the man who had swept her off her feet with his charm, kindness, and unwavering devotion. He had been her rock through life's storms, her safe place, her future. They had met in the most unexpected way, one of those chance encounters that felt like fate. From the moment their eyes locked, something clicked, as if the universe had conspired to bring them together. Late-night calls turned into endless conversations, stolen glances turned into deep stares, filled with unspoken promises. He made her feel special, like she was the only woman in the world. Yet, despite the seemingly perfect love story, there had been moments, small, fleeting moments, where something felt off. A hesitation in his voice when certain topics came up, a guarded look in his eyes when she asked about his past. He was loving, attentive, everything she could want in a partner, but sometimes it felt as if a part of him was hidden away, locked behind an invisible door she was never meant to open. She had brushed it aside, believing that love was about trust, about accepting someone even when they weren't ready to share everything. But now, standing on the cusp of forever, that nagging feeling refused to be silenced. A knock at the door pulled her out of her thoughts. Her best friend peeked in, grinning. "Are you ready?" "It's time." She took a deep breath, forcing a smile. "Yes, I'm ready." As she stepped forward, the unease still clung to her, whispering in the back of her mind. Something was coming. She could feel it, but she had no idea just how much this day would change her life forever. The venue was breathtaking, a perfect reflection of the love story she had always dreamed of. Delicate white flowers adorned every table, their fragrance mingling with the soft notes of a violin playing in the background. Golden lights twinkled like stars, casting a warm glow over the guests, who were dressed in their finest attire, their laughter and chatter filling the air. It was a picture-perfect wedding, the kind people talked about for years. She stood at the entrance of the grand hall, her veil cascading down her back, her fingers clutching the bouquet of fresh roses. The moment was here, the moment she had imagined countless times. But instead of feeling the overwhelming joy she had always expected, there was a strange weight pressing against her chest. Her breath came in shallow waves as her heart pounded, not with excitement, but with something she couldn't quite name. As the music swelled, she took her first step down the aisle, her father's arm steadying her. All eyes were on her, friends, family, loved ones, all smiling, all watching. And at the end of the aisle, there he was, her soon-to-be husband. He looked handsome, standing tall in his tailored suit, his eyes locked onto hers. But as she searched his face, she saw something flicker there, something fleeting, something unreadable. Her throat tightened. Why did she suddenly feel like a stranger in her own love story? A tear slipped down her cheek and she quickly blinked, trying to push the emotions away. It was just nerves. That's what everyone said about brides, right? That the emotions of the day could be overwhelming. But this wasn't the rush of happiness she had hoped for. This was something else. The guests noticed, murmuring softly among themselves. Her mother dabbed at her own eyes, smiling as if she understood the depth of her daughter's emotions. Her best friend gave her a reassuring nod, believing the tears were from pure joy. Even her fiancé's lips curved into a small smile, as if moved by the depth of her feelings. But none of them knew the truth. As she reached the altar, standing mere inches from the man she was about to marry, the feeling grew stronger. A deep sadness settled in her bones, as if her soul knew something she didn't. She forced a smile, willing herself to push through to silence the doubt screaming in her mind. This was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. So why did it feel like something was about to break? As she stood before him at the altar, she expected to see love in his eyes, the same warmth that had always reassured her. But something was different. His hands were cold when he took hers, his grip not as firm as she remembered. His smile was there, but it didn't reach his eyes. And then, for just a second, he glanced away. Not at the priest, not at the guests, but somewhere beyond them, as if searching for something or someone. Her heart clenched. Why did he look so distracted? The ceremony continued, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he was barely present. His gaze flickered restlessly, his fingers tightening around hers just a little too late after every cue. And then she noticed the sweat forming at his temples despite the cool breeze drifting through the open-air venue. A whisper caught her attention. Someone among the guests, someone close to the front, leaned toward him and murmured something low, just before the vows. He gave the smallest nod, almost imperceptible, but she saw it. Her stomach twisted. Who was that? And what had they just said to him? The unease she had felt all morning now turned into something sharper, something closer to fear. Then, as if the moment wasn't strange enough, his phone vibrated. He had given his phone to his best man earlier, but now it was back in his hand. He pulled it out briefly, just enough to glance at the screen. His face paled, his jaw clenched. And then, just like that, he slipped it back into his pocket as if nothing had happened. But she had seen the shift. The way his shoulders tensed, the way his throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. Something was wrong. She barely heard the officiant's words anymore. Her pulse roared in her ears. Was he having second thoughts? Was this the moment he realized he didn't want to marry her? Or was it something worse? The whispers, the unreadable glance, the phone call, it all pointed to something hidden, something she wasn't meant to know. Her fingers trembled slightly in his grasp, but he didn't seem to notice. He was too distracted. And when she whispered his name under her breath, a quiet plea for reassurance, he flinched. It was small, almost unnoticeable. But for her, it was everything. The man she had loved, the man she had trusted with her future, was keeping something from her. And whatever it was big enough to make him tremble on their wedding day. The ceremony continued, but the bride felt detached, as if watching her own wedding from a distance. The uneasy feeling gripping her chest refused to fade. She had always imagined this moment to be one of pure bliss, yet doubt clouded every thought. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw her. A woman seated near the back, dressed in deep emerald green, striking yet unfamiliar. The bride had spent months planning the guest list, ensuring that every face in the room was one she knew. But this woman, she didn't belong. There was something about her presence, something almost haunting. Her posture was too rigid, her expression too intense. While the other guests smiled and dabbed at happy tears, this woman did neither. Instead, her gaze was locked on the groom, unwavering, unreadable. The bride's breath hitched. Who was she? The woman didn't fidget, didn't glance around like the others. She just stared at him. A strange energy crackled in the air, making the bride's skin prickle. Was she a forgotten friend? A distant relative? A colleague? No matter how hard she searched her memory, she couldn't place her. Her hands instinctively tightened around the bouquet. Then, as if sensing the weight of her gaze, the woman's eyes suddenly flicked to hers. For a split second, time froze. The moment their eyes met, a shiver ran down the bride's spine. The woman's expression remained unreadable, but there was something in her eyes, something unsettling, a silent message only she could understand. The bride swallowed hard. A part of her wanted to look away, to pretend she hadn't noticed, but she couldn't. Her feet felt rooted to the floor, her hands clammy despite the cool breeze, and then, just as suddenly as the moment began, the woman's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. Not warm, not friendly, a knowing smile. And that was when the bride knew. This woman, whoever she was, wasn't just another guest. She was here for him, and she was here for a reason. The moment had come. The officiant turned to the groom, prompting him to repeat the vows. The bride held her breath, waiting for the words that would bind them together forever. But as he opened his mouth to speak, his voice faltered. He cleared his throat, shifting on his feet. His hands, still clutching hers, felt ice cold. A nervous chuckle escaped his lips, but it didn't ease the tension. The guests stirred slightly, some exchanging amused glances, assuming it was just wedding jitters. But the bride knew better. She could see it in his eyes, the hesitation, the flicker of panic. Something was wrong. He forced himself to continue, pushing the words past his lips. I, groom's name, take you, bride's name, to be my... Then, a voice cut through the air. A woman's voice. Stop. Gasps echoed through the venue. Heads turned. The murmurs of the crowd swelled into a wave of confusion. The bride's heart pounded as she turned toward the source of the voice. It was her. The woman in green. She had risen from her seat, her expression unreadable, yet powerful enough to command the entire room's attention. The bride's fingers slipped from the groom's grasp. Her breath came in shallow, uneven waves. Who is she? Someone whispered from the audience. The woman took a slow, deliberate step forward. I'm sorry, but this wedding cannot continue. A cold dread seeped into the bride's bones. The groom's face drained of all colour. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came out. Tell her the truth, the woman continued, her gaze locked onto him. Tell all of them the truth. The bride felt as if the floor beneath her had disappeared. The world blurred around her, the murmurs and shocked exclamations becoming distant noise. The groom turned to her, his eyes filled with something she had never seen before. Guilt. Deep, consuming guilt. And in that moment she knew, whatever secret he had been keeping, it was about to destroy everything. The silence in the room was deafening. Every pair of eyes was locked on the mysterious woman in green, who stood tall and unshaken, her gaze never leaving the groom. The bride felt her pulse hammering in her ears, her fingers trembling as she clutched the fabric of her wedding dress. The groom finally found his voice, but it was weak, almost pleading. Please, not here. The woman let out a bitter laugh. Not here. Where then? After you've said your vows? After you've trapped her in a lie? Her voice was sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. The bride's stomach twisted. A lie? The woman turned to her, her expression softer now. I'm sorry you have to find out this way, she said, voice laced with both pity and anger. But I couldn't let you walk into this blind. A lump formed in the bride's throat. She couldn't speak, couldn't move. She needed to hear it. The truth. The woman took a deep breath. I am his wife. Gasps erupted throughout the hall. A murmur spread like wildfire. The bride felt the world tilt beneath her. Her knees wobbled and she reached for something, anything to steady herself. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "That's not possible." The groom's face was drained of all colour. He didn't deny it. He didn't fight back. And that silence was more damning than any words. The woman stepped closer, her eyes flashing with hurt and betrayal. "We've been married for 3 years. 3 years, and he never told you." The bride's breath came in shallow gasps. She looked at the man she thought she knew, the man she had loved with every piece of her heart. "Tell me she's lying," she begged, her voice barely above a whisper. The groom swallowed hard, his lips parting, but the words didn't come, because there were no lies to tell. The bride's heart shattered. Tears blurred her vision as the weight of betrayal crushed her chest. She had trusted him. She had built a future with him. And all along, he had been living a double life. The guests whispered in hushed, horrified tones. Some looked away, uncomfortable, while others openly gawked at the unfolding disaster. The officiant, caught in the storm, cleared his throat awkwardly. "Perhaps we should—" But the bride didn't hear the rest. Everything around her faded into white noise. She had cried walking down the aisle, unsure why sadness had gripped her on what was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. Now she knew. Her heart had seen the truth before her eyes did. The weight of betrayal pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She stood frozen at the altar, surrounded by friends, family, and strangers who had come to celebrate love. But instead, they were witnessing its destruction. The whispers, the gasps, the judging eyes burned into her skin, but none of it compared to the pain clawing at her heart. Her fingers trembled as she wiped away a stray tear. She had never felt so humiliated, so foolish. How could she have been so blind? Flashbacks flooded her mind, small moments, little warnings she had brushed aside. The way he had always hesitated when she talked about their future. The phone calls he would take in another room, always saying, "It's nothing important." The weekend trips he claimed were for work, but now she wondered, was he with her? And that lingering sadness she had felt all morning, the unshakable doubt deep in her bones. Had her heart known all along? She turned to him now, her voice hoarse. "How could you do this to me?" He finally spoke, his voice desperate. "I was going to tell you, I didn't know how." A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "You didn't know how?" She shook her head in disbelief. "So you thought the best option was to let me stand here in front of everyone, believing I was marrying a man who truly loved me?" He reached for her hand, but she stepped back. "I love you," he said, his voice breaking. "I never meant to hurt you." Her stomach twisted. She had once dreamed of hearing those words on this day, but not like this. Not with a lie hanging between them like a guillotine. "If you loved me," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "you would have told me the truth." He swallowed hard, his eyes pleading. "I was afraid of losing you." A tear rolled down her cheek, but she quickly wiped it away. "You lost me the moment you decided to lie." The silence that followed was deafening. She could feel the eyes of every guest on her, waiting to see what she would do next. Her heart was broken, her world shattered. But one thing was clear: she refused to be the woman who stayed and accepted betrayal. With one last look at the man she had almost married, she turned away. And this time, she wasn't crying because she was heartbroken. She was crying because she was done. She stood in the bridal suite, staring at her reflection in the mirror. The wedding dress she had once adored now felt like a cruel joke. The lace, the pearls, the delicate embroidery, none of it mattered anymore. It was supposed to symbolize a new beginning, a lifetime of love. Instead, it had become a reminder of the worst betrayal she had ever known. Tears welled in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had already cried enough. A knock at the door broke her trance. Her best friend entered first, her face filled with concern. "We're all here for you," she said softly. Her mother followed, eyes glistening with unshed tears. My love, you don't have to do this, she whispered, taking her daughter's hand. You don't have to marry a man who doesn't deserve you. The weight of those words settled deep in her chest. Didn't deserve her. She had spent years believing this man was her future, ignoring every moment of doubt, every whisper of intuition telling her something wasn't right. And now, she was left picking up the pieces of a dream that had never been real to begin with. Her hands clenched into fists. She felt anger. At him. At the lies. At herself for not seeing it sooner. She felt sadness, mourning the love she thought she had. And worst of all, she felt self-doubt. Had she not been enough? Had she been so easy to deceive? Her best friend placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. This isn't your fault, she inhaled sharply, forcing herself to steady. It wasn't. It wasn't her fault that he had lied. It wasn't her fault that he had been a coward. And it wasn't her fault that he had shattered the life they had built together. But it was her choice, what happened next. The thought made her heart pound. She had a decision to make. She could walk back out there, pretend none of this had happened, force a smile and say, I do. But then what? She would live in the shadow of his betrayal, always wondering if she could trust him, always questioning his every move. Or she could choose herself. The answer was suddenly clear. With one final glance in the mirror, she wiped away the last of her tears. I deserve better, she whispered to her reflection. Then, turning to her mother and best friend, she nodded. Let's go. The doors of the suite swung open and she walked out, not toward the altar but toward freedom. And for the first time that day, she didn't feel like crying. She felt powerful. She stepped back into the wedding hall, her heart steady, her mind clear. The murmurs from the guests swelled the moment they saw her. Some whispered in sympathy, others in shock. But she didn't care. She wasn't here for them. She was here for herself. The groom stood at the altar, his face pale, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. His eyes searched hers, pleading, desperate. Please, he said, barely above a whisper. Don't do this. We can fix it. She exhaled slowly, shaking her head. No, she said, her voice firm. You broke it. And I won't spend my life fixing something that was never real. The weight of her words settled over the room. No one moved. No one spoke. Her father, who had been seated in the front row, stood up. His face was unreadable, but his eyes, filled with quiet pride, met hers. He gave her a single nod. Her best friend clasped her hands together, a smile breaking through the tension. Her mother wiped at her eyes, but this time they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of pride. She turned to face the guests, standing taller than she ever had before. I won't be marrying him today, she announced, her voice steady, and I won't apologize for choosing myself. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The groom took a step forward, panic flickering across his face. Wait, but she didn't. She turned on her heel, her wedding gown billowing around her as she walked down the aisle, not as a woman abandoned, not as a victim of betrayal, but as a woman who refused to settle for anything less than she deserved. Every step felt lighter. Every breath felt freer. By the time she reached the grand doors of the hall, she realized something. She had dreamed of this day her entire life, and now it was the best day of her life, because she had chosen herself. The sun filtered through her apartment window, casting a warm glow on the hardwood floors. She stretched, breathing in the crisp morning air, feeling lighter than she had in months. It had been a long road to get here. The pain hadn't vanished overnight. The betrayal had left scars and the heartbreak had threatened to consume her. But she had refused to let it define her. In the days after walking away, she had cried, screamed, questioned everything. She had replayed every moment, every red flag, every whispered doubt she had ignored. But instead of letting it break her, she had chosen to rebuild. She had travelled. A solo trip to the mountains where she had stood at the edge of a cliff, arms spread wide, letting the wind remind her that she was alive, free. She had pursued passions she had once set aside for love: painting, writing, dancing in her kitchen at midnight. She had learned to love herself again. Now, months later, she looked back at her wedding day with a clarity she never thought possible. There was no bitterness, no regret, only gratitude, because that day hadn't been the end of her story. It had been the beginning of a new one. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. A message from a close friend. "Proud of you. Hope today is amazing." She smiled, stepping into the sunlight. It would be amazing. Today was the launch of her new business, a dream she had put on hold when she was planning a future with the wrong person. But now she was unstoppable. As she grabbed her keys, a knock sounded at the door. She opened it to find someone waiting. A familiar face, someone she had met along her journey of healing. A friend, a new love, perhaps. But for the first time, she wasn't rushing to find out. She was content, knowing that whatever the future held, she was ready, because she had chosen herself first, and that had made all the difference.